currency in the form of gold and silver coins, both in terms of the quantity and quality. And roughly less than 10% of transactions were conducted using cash, meaning that credit was becoming increasingly important. So much so that by the late 17th century, roughly 1/4 of households were actually spending more than they were earning. So Mulderry says that whereas today the value of capital held in banks is simply based upon its buying power in terms of price, which is considered quite different from the way in which people value love, friendship or compassion, in early modern England it was impossible to make such a conceptual divide. Price was an important part of value, but other personal factors such as honesty, chastity, lineage, charity, hospitality, respectability could affect the valuation of something in an exchange. Therefore, and this is a quote, the inadequacy and uncertainty of money in the early modern economy meant that the consistency and abstraction of modern price information was impossible, and as a result, monetary value remained enmeshed with other values, end quote. So what existed basically was a credit economy where everything was measured by monetary prices, but where money was not the primary means of exchange. And building on this work, Alexander Shepard has suggested rather than consisting the basis of credit, such bonds of trust merely overlaid their more concrete foundations in the goods that both represented wealth and provided security against a default. From the late 17th century, goods held a less prominent place as forms of investment than they had done several decades earlier, and as we enter the 18th century, middling people had more of their wealth in non-productive forms of material property and in virtual forms of wealth, such as credit and financial instruments. So basically this means that individuals came to rely less on what they physically had as indications of credibility. And moving on, Tawny Paul has discussed imprisonment for debt amongst the aspiring middle sort or the middle class. Tawny Paul has shown how most 18th century households held their wealth in a combination of household goods, trade stock, production equipment, credit, money and livestock. But again, Paul shows how the value of short-term credit was often 4 or 5 times greater than a household's fixed assets. So the point to make here is that middling people held the majority of their wealth in the form of obligations owed to them by other people. So therefore, a household could be technically wealthy in terms of the overall value of its assets, but they could default or become insolvent on debts if those assets were not easily mobilised to pay off their debts. As Tawny Paul concludes, prison records show that debtors were not poor, but rather they lacked a means to transfer their assets to their creditors. Okay, finally, Beverley Lemire provides a sort of nice overview and description of the use of alternative currencies in early modern England, particularly in relation to the second-hand trade in clothing and manufacturing. So I just want to read out this quote because I think it's sort of a nice summary. In the early modern era, uses of alternate currencies in the second-hand trade were an unremarkable feature of daily finance for noblemen and commoners. The absence of an adequate supply of coins encouraged alternative currencies to flourish as specie substitutes, and this remained a vital element of plebeian budgeting for centuries. Alternative currencies were one of the mechanisms enabling routine exchanges and underpinning everyday credit. As regional economies thrived, the second-hand trade also encouraged patterns of consumption where objects such as apparel, decorative garments and household wares acted as stores of value to be released and needed through the market. So what this means is alternative currencies enabled the purchase of goods, but also the payment of debts and the granting of credit. So really what I'm interested in is not just how alternative currencies such as goods were used in the repayment of debts, but also how individuals involved in bankruptcy sought to look back and try and put an external objective price and monetary value on goods, services, credit and debts. All of this which was occurring within the trade environment prior to an individual's failure. So here on the slide we can see a schedule or an appraisement from the bankrupt trader's house and workshop. This is fairly common as all goods and equipment relating to a bankruptcy could be seized and sold for the benefit of the creditors. Here we can see that 2 tables were seized which were worth 8 shillings and also a large looking glass which was worth 15 shillings, and this was found in the hall. From this same schedule, so this is the same example, we can also see that in the nursery, creditors have seized a corner cupboard, an old chest of drawers and a bed with a rug, 1 sheet and 2 blankets worth £1, 7 shillings and 6 pence. And I think this is a good example of the sort of inability to clearly separate business and personal liability during the period. This has obviously been taken from the child's bedroom. This is from the same example. This is creditors printed an advertisement of the sale of the goods in Bristol. And here we can see many large quantities and parcels of the following goods and merchandises. And there's some examples here such as Spanish wool, English wool, papers, and so on. So you can see the sort of breadth of goods and alternative currencies used in an attempt to pay off the debts of the bankrupt. Okay, just to sort of finish off, I want to quickly run through a case in a bit of detail, hopefully to demonstrate how the court tried to mediate in social and financial affairs and come to an account for the credit and debts of those involved in bankruptcy. This is actually a different case to the one I put in my paper summary, so hopefully this will be sort of a different example. So this is Waele versus Stonnell in 1710. This was decided 3 years later in the 13th of February, 1713. We see the plaintiffs, William Riley, William Appleby and Mary Hartwell. All three of these were creditors of Elizabeth Dye, who was a widow, who owned a coffee house and a stagecoach in Oxford. It's actually quite rare for women to be declared bankrupt during this period, so I think this is another interesting example. We also see the defendants, and we see Mary Hartwell was a widow and executor of Elizabeth Dye's brother, Richard Hartwell. So some of the descriptions we see in this case: in November 1702, Dye asked her brother to be a coachman, paying him a wage of 5 shillings a week on top of his room and board, to run journeys between Oxford and London. The plaintiffs claimed that Hartwell worked for his sister for the space of 6 years, but he never received any wages, instead being content to let them rest in the hands of his said sister, hoping it might be a kindness to her in her way of trade, not doubting but she had been in good circumstances and would have paid him when requested. So it was further suggested that Hartwell lent his sister the sum of £10, sold her a fat hog, so that was worth £2, 12 shillings and 9.5 pence, and also kept a child of Dye's for above 6 years, for which he was owed £8 a year. So what we can see here is the attempted calculation and the attempt to put an external monetary value on the wages and the childcare activities of Hartwell, the appraisal of the price of a hog, and this is all occurring over a 6 to 8 year period. So in lieu of cash, Dye provided some household goods, horses, and her stagecoach to Hartwell, who subsequently agreed to sell the goods to the two named defendants, John Stonnell and Richard Wise, for £178. However, Hartwell died, leaving his wife Mary as the sole executor of his estate, and never received any payment for the goods, which remained in the defendant's possession. I think what's interesting in this suit is the way in which the defendants are accused of manipulating the bankruptcy process and taking advantage of Richard Hartwell's death in order to avoid paying their debts. They refused to pay Mary Hartwell by claiming she had no right to the debt, as Elizabeth Dye was a bankrupt and had absconded before the making of the said deed, bargain or sale. However, when the creditors tried to seek repayment, they claimed that Dye was not a bankrupt and Mary Hartwell had the only legitimate claim to the goods in her possession. And so they put it off from one to another and eventually paid no one. On December the 2nd, 1712, the case came to be heard and the court found in favour of the defendants. Unfortunately, there's quite limited information about why this was, but in cases like this, we can see how additional pieces of information relating to the need to calculate and repay debts can be used to piece together the ways in which alternative currencies were used in debt recovery. Okay, just some very brief concluding remarks then. So working through and untangling these complex and multifaceted cases, I think illuminates the diversity of alternative currencies utilised in debt recovery. I think if we take these cases in isolation, they grant us insights into the way individuals dealt with specific issues, managed to circumnavigate problems within a commission of bankruptcy. We can see the range of goods and services that were debated and discussed for the endless purpose of the satisfaction of interconnected accounts. I think collectively, if you put a lot of these cases together, they demonstrate that the ideals established in the statutes and the law did not always conform to the sort of practical realities of procedure. While goods and services obviously had a fixed and external monetary valuation attached to them, and objective determination was extremely difficult to maintain over an extended period of time. Debts were very frequently paid, reduced, compromised, or cancelled. And the brief overview of the case above shows how there were numerous attempts to settle and come to an account for the back and forth exchanges in trade over this 6-year period. Ultimately, the broader research associated with this paper will show that the court sought to identify failure as a social construct at law in order to mediate in social and financial affairs. Ultimately, the court acted as an arbitrator, assessing each individual claim and attempting to render a fair and equitable judgment for financial transactions, which I think can illuminate the broad range of alternative currencies used for the satisfaction of debts, which came about due to a broad range of services and exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let me use yours. Our second speakers are Thijs Lambrecht and Tom Waele from the University of Ghent.
Could you please set up the file?
Did you load it? Did you load it?
Did we load it? Good afternoon. In this presentation, we would like to draw attention to some alternative forms of currency that were used in Low Countries during the late medieval and early modern period, especially in relations between lords and their subjects. In particular, we look at the remuneration and compensation practices concerning servile works or labor services executed by peasantries to the benefit of the lord. We will show that in lordships where servile works persisted during the late Middle Ages, labor services executed by the peasantries were frequently compensated. And this compensation was markedly different from remuneration schemes that characterized the labor market, as they did not take the form of a traditional cash wage, but concerned commodities, services, and use rights. Before turning to these specific remuneration schemes, however, we will sketch the contours and modalities of servile works from the late medieval to the end of the early modern period. Whereas servile works are traditionally regarded as a form of pure seigneurial surplus extraction, whereby the lord was the only beneficiary of such corvée labor, this does not hold true for the southern Low Countries. There, unfree peasant work degraded rapidly during the late Middle Ages and onwards. While labor services continued to exist until the end of the old regime, we have indications that, when peasants still executed such activities, it was more the exception to the rule. Various factors facilitated this crumbling of seigneurial privilege. First, lords phased out direct exploitation of their own domains themselves, so they required less labor. Second, the speed and quality of servile work would have been inferior to that of wage labor. And third, a top-down restriction and supervision policy by territorial rulers kept overzealous lords in check. All of these elements beg the question why corvée labor endured in those exceptional cases, that it did. And we possess excellent sources for lordships where servile works were carried out until the end of the 18th century. Manorial customs reveal that the modalities surrounding work for the lord were often the result of intensive negotiation with his subjects. While we do possess some evidence of resistance against manorial labor, sources such as customs and accounts record less extreme cases of compliance and obedience. These instances of compliance suggest more pragmatic and more peaceful forms of peasant agency, whereby beneficial terms for the agrarian workers were successfully negotiated with their lords. During this presentation, we will demonstrate three major elements facilitating such improved labor circumstances, namely commutation, which was the buying off of the obligation to work by the peasants, favorable rules on the execution of such labor, and lastly, the wide variety of remuneration forms for peasants. During the late Middle Ages, lords could usually claim around 5 working days from their subjects. The service could also be restricted to a certain work volume, for example, mowing a meadow. The demanded chores varied along with the socio-economic status of those inhabitants. Those possessing horses or carts were called upon by the lord to use those assets in service of their lord. So there was a distinction between subjects performing transportation activities and between those who could only perform manual labor. The socio-economic difference also impacted the conversion of labor services to a commuted payment, for the haute corvée could be bought off by inhabitants. Local subjects had, in other words, significant agency. They could determine each year whether they wanted to perform the required task or whether they would rather pay a fee to buy back their time from the lord. Such payments correlated with the socio-economic background of the subjects and the work that they would normally do. Relatively well-off peasants owning horses or carts usually paid a larger commutation than common laborers, though the difference was often not that big. For example, in Kalken, east of Ghent, it only amounted to 1 groot. These conversions and redemptions of labor could not only happen on an individual or a yearly basis. We also have iterations of collective commutations, where whole communities negotiated temporary or permanent exemptions of servile works. The inhabitants of a lordship could, for example, propose to buy off their corvées with one big lump sum. They could also offer a recurring payment in exchange for their free time. Such events can be seen as a win-win or as a lose-lose situation. The lord, on the one hand, successfully converted his possibly negligible surplus for a direct disposable income, be it recurrent or a one-off big sum of money, cash. He therefore suffered the loss of a part of his lordship. The peasants, on the other hand, were relieved from a humiliating obligation, however, at a greater economic cost than simply performing the yearly corvée itself. Sources on such practices of commutation, such as notebooks of stewards or seigneurial accounts, showcase dynamic rural societies. Inhabitants migrated, passed away, moved upward or downward the social ladder, and all of this impacted the practice of servile labor. According to their complex personal situation, peasants made equally complex decisions on their performance and on compliance of corvées. Accounts for boelaren, for example, display households that opted for payment to 1 year and executed works the following year. As a consequence, lords and their personnel had to maintain an elaborate administration in order to protect and impose those rights for corvées. Now, when the option of performing labor was chosen, these services were rigorously regulated. Local customs are rife with extremely detailed instructions on the modalities of these services. Oddly enough, the content of these customs portrays how strong peasant communities stood in the southern Low Countries to negotiate the terms of their labor obligations. For the regulations contain elaborate protection of workers from labor extortions by their lord. The lord's estate only came second, for he could not claim works during the harvest period. Furthermore, when he did ask for labor, the request was heavily formalized. Specific procedures and timeframes were prescribed in order to give peasants enough leeway. Days of servile labor had to be communicated in advance, from a couple of days, 1 or 3 days, up to 3 weeks beforehand. If these procedures were not followed and not met, it gave subjects the right to legitimately refuse performance. The peasantry's working time was protected even further. It was impossible for lords to transfer unclaimed working days from 1 year to the next. He could only ask his given maximum amount of services per year. That was it. This contrasts to the privileges enjoyed by the laborers themselves, who could send replacements to work instead of them. Also, absence during working days was not immediately punished or sanctioned. We have extensive documentation on the duration of working days, which generally started at sunrise and lasted until sunset. Exceptions for unfavorable weather conditions existed as well. In Soiron, for example, haymakers were allowed to return home in the event of rainfall, although they were expected to return to work the following day at the exact same time that they laid down the service. Lastly, a detailed survey of the location where corvées should happen was paramount if servile rights entailed certain task volume. This was the case, for example, for Herzele, where 2 meadows were explicitly named in the lordship's dénombrement for hay works, namely the Lankmeers and the Melkenbeek. So these customs on the execution of service duties clearly show that by the late Middle Ages, seigneurial subjects still acknowledged their lord's rights to claim those corvées. However, their former socio-political power had increased dramatically, rendering a stronger negotiation position for themselves and thereby weakening the lordships of their seigneurs.
Although it may sound somewhat contradictory, servile works in the late medieval Low Countries were in most cases compensated by the lord. Remuneration in the form of cash wages existed, however, was very rare. In such rare cases, the workers received a customary wage that did not change over time. However, as I said, such cash payments by the lords in exchange for servile works were uncommon. Instead, we find that lords found other ways to remunerate their subjects for the labor they performed. First and foremost, and most frequently, the most frequent form of compensation was food, or as one set of customs stated, l'Isire doit donner à manger. The earliest reference we find for the southern Low Countries date from 12012 for the seigneury of Salèche, and the custom to provide laborers with food during the execution of their servile works probably started somewhere during the first half of the 13th century. In most of the customs we consulted for the 14th and 15th century, there is an explicit reference to the provisioning of food by the lord during these servile works. In some customs, reference to food are short or rather vague, while in others they are very detailed and elaborate. It is clear, however, that most peasantries would only engage in servile works if their calories were replenished at the direct expense of the lord. As illustrated by the many examples in our paper, the provisioning of food clearly mattered to those who performed servile works, given the many details included in the customs. These customs indicate that or record not only the number of meals, but also the specific quantities and qualities of the food that the lord had to supply. Also, the timing and location of the distribution of these food rations were subject to customary rules. Food rations were in many cases uniform for all subjects, but were sometimes also differentiated depending on the nature of the work. Hard work required more calories and therefore more food, or these rations were based on the social and economic background of the peasantries. In any case, servile works entailed a cost for the lord and therefore cannot be considered a source of free labor. Importantly, from the perspective of the peasantries, the provisioning of food during servile works meant that labor performed for the lord did not come at a direct cost. In most cases, sufficient food was provided to compensate the workers for the calories they expended. And in some cases, the food rations were so extensive during servile works that some peasantries probably ate better and more quality food compared to their daily diets. Now, next to the provisioning of, Next to the provisioning of food rations, lords also remunerated their subjects by granting them use rights or access to common resources. The most common form of this compensation was through the provisioning of communal animals, or the so-called Verfaillie, which is the German term. Now, such arrangements stipulated that the lord had to supply the community with male animals that could be used for reproduction. In the customs, there are references to stallions, bulls, and boars that had to be supplied, fed, and maintained on the domain of the lord. The subjects of the lord could use these animals free of charge to inseminate their own farm animals. These animals also enjoyed a privileged and protected status within the community. And next to these reproduction animals, lords also granted use rights on their lands in exchange for labor services. In most cases, these concerned pasture rights on the land owned by the lord, or in some cases, the right to collect vegetation on lands owned by the lord. Such arrangements were dominant, in particular in the southern parts of the Low Countries, where pastoral agriculture was dominant. Now, in both types of arrangements, the Verfaillie and the pasture rights, access to resources owned by the lord, were exchanged for labor. For peasantries, this made sound economic sense. Male animals were expensive, especially for small holdings, and beyond insemination had little economic use or value. Also, through pasture rights, peasantries could temporarily enlarge their holdings. Now, the third and final form of compensation peasantries received in exchange for their labor for these servile works can be catalogued as exemptions, privileges, or monopolies. These types of remuneration either exempted peasantries from other seigneurial rights or drastically reduced them. These could include, for example, the exemption from tolls or the obligation to use the mill of the lord to grind their grain. Such arrangements reduced the fiscal pressure of the lords by way of labor services. Next to exemptions, lords also granted monopolies to reward peasantries, remunerate peasantries for their works. In the Seigneurie of Bergen op Zoom, for example, which included some 20 rural settlements around the city Bergen op Zoom, peasantries were able to negotiate a transport monopoly. In the late medieval period, the two fairs in Bergen op Zoom attracted a growing international audience of buyers and sellers, and developed in the course of the 15th century into one of the most important Brabantine fairs. Now, during these two fairs, one held around Easter and the other around All Saints' Day, all transport of goods and wares executed with horses from, to, and within the city was the exclusive monopoly for the horse owners of this lordship, of this seigneurie. In exchange for this temporary transport monopoly during the fairs that lasted several weeks, the horse owners of the seigneurie agreed to cart the fuel of the lord during the summer months. So again, lords and peasantries entered an agreement that was seemingly mutually beneficial. The lord was entitled to servile works, but this resulted in reduced fiscal pressure for peasantries in the case of exemptions, or in increased income for the peasantries in the case of the transport monopoly of Bergen op Zoom. So, to conclude, what we have tried to do in our paper is take a fresh look at the organization and remuneration of servile works in the late medieval and the early modern Low Countries. And our analysis, I think, shows that in many lordships, servile works somewhat strangely survived the late medieval period. And that this survival, we argue, was not a result of powerful and successful lords imposing labor obligations on their subjects. On the contrary, labor services survived and possibly even thrived because they were subject to active negotiations between peasantries and lords. Peasantries agreed to perform servile works, clearly delineated and restricted, but only if they received some form of compensation. And as we have shown, or hope to have shown, these compensations could take very different forms, ranging from food over use rights to fiscal exemptions. In all cases, however, we find that servile works cannot be represented as a unilateral transfer of resources from the peasantries to the lord. In most cases, the execution of servile works was probably budget neutral, as the compensations provided by the lord largely covered the costs faced by the peasantries. Thank you.
Because our speakers have been so kindly stuck to the limits, Natacha, maybe you could come up and we'll do a third paper and then take a break, because thank you for being so efficient. Our third speaker is Natacha Coquery from Lyon.
Adesso la prossima relatrice è Natacha Coquery, che viene da Lione. Parlerò francese. My research deals with a period, with a rather long period of time, allowing some political analysis on trade during a crisis period. My proposal deals with crucial provisioning, paving the way for the future revolution. This deals with these difficult relationships. Some luxury barter was introduced. We would like to prove that using this kind of aristocratic barter to regulate both import and export of raw material is part of a crisis context. This is part of a period where there was a failure of other alternative currencies. Therefore, the so-called republic barter is based on ancien regime, corresponding to the attempt of imposing this in a very critical period. We need to focus on two main points. On one side, we have a familiarity with the use of barter at that time as a trading exchange, and on the other side, war against France. Barter is a common habit in trade in the 18th century. Merchants are still using these means of payment. As a merchant says that he had a barter with some commodity in order to say that no money was used. Fortien, in his dictionary, underlines the importance of barter as a means of exchange. As an alternative currency, they use some jewels for barter. Therefore, entrepreneurs and also consumers are very much focused on this kind of alternative currency. Aristocrats are very dynamic in this context. There is a chronic lack of cash flow. Therefore, barter is an easy way to buy commodities. Some products are being used that are no longer used. Therefore, aristocrats become large suppliers of luxury objects, furniture, jewels, silverware. And of course, there is somebody earning from that. And the workers too, laborers are happy too, because it is a good way to be paid. Therefore, ancient luxury products that are circulating a lot. And in retail trade, barter is a form of redistribution following overconsumption, therefore fostering the market. What is striking is the change of scale. To meet the nation's needs, and not just a few single players wishing to meet their own needs. Barter is being used. Therefore, this can be useful to face some treasury-related problems, warfare, provisioning. These all can help or supplies, and also international exchange. So this solves the problem of supplies. Protectionism on one side, and then a controlled recovery of exchange. Starting exports, followed by relaunching of national production and therefore luxury, used as alternative currencies. Protectionist policy aimed at facing the risk of a famine for the army, fostering international production and harming trade. This was a double-sword weapon, providing the import.
C'est ce qui explique la réouverture des frontières et la mise en place d'une sorte de
double-sided weapon. Therefore, the export of luxury products recalled by American capital was authorized, but they had to be compensated by necessary products. Therefore, the French can export luxury goods provided the product will be paid with exports in raw materials. The idea was suggested to the Committee of Public Health as a crucial element. This is also indicated in Annex 1. Robert de Lander, a member of the Committee for Public Policies, underlines that this can be a double advantage, fostering luxury production and increasing products. This, of course, becomes exacerbated during 30 years' war with the threat of a famine. In this context, we have the idea of commodities as an alternative currency. The lack of currency, with the lack of currency, the solution will be barter. But we have to face the problem of payment of the expenses, therefore, the assignats based on national goods. And the following crisis causes some downward speculation, which is a disaster for foreign trade. The liquid currency is used to pay soldiers and to pay commodities. But it also involves the lack of public money. It is hard to recover taxes, etc. In this time of famine, the Republic is under pressure and it did not know what to do in spite of some market acceleration, the authorization of exports. Paris is a repository or warehouse of furniture with great terror. And it is full of migrants and sentenced people. Therefore, auction selling is made possible, and this has an impact on public financing. This was a way to activate circulation of goods without changing the situation, therefore, a luxury export, the import of commodities.
À la disposition de la Commission des subsistances, ce qui revient.
Therefore, we have confiscated property, and this, of course, authorizes exchanges again on non-monetized goods or commodities. The idea of barter is part of this debate. In December, it says, they say, trade is an exchange, therefore barter is an important way for exchanging in a society that is thinking of using money from theory to reality. The decree of March the 1st of 1904 was decisive. It is based on diamonds, which can be easily transported and very small. Therefore, precious stones, diamonds, they could be useful for some exchange with commodities, for exchanging with commodities. The operation is requiring different administrations. The report of the Finance Committee, they authorized in October of 1994, there is an expedition of diamonds, more than 2 million liras. Some survey was done by jewelers, and then all these diamonds, these commodities have reached their final destination. Then there was a plan on another expedition to be done later, including some policemen, a 2-day trip to support the heavy route, the heavy road to travel, with some hostage in strategic points. Then the second stop, the second step is the decree of March the 22nd. The Commission has all the real estate and the pressure objects of sentenced people that can be exported, both movable and immovable property, the former royal palaces involved at the same time. And the same is for large buildings and homes. They can be preserved for some later exchange. And according to the report of the Subsistence Commission, this all was necessary involving some decision-making. The Ministry of the Interior activates this Committee for Public Health, writing a decree in order for the ministry to provide commissioners with a large amount. And it is part of the aristocratic population. This agent is dealing with establishing the amount and sending the Commission large amounts of cloth, which can be withheld from selling and which can be successfully used as an alternative currency. The Commission is asking the Committee for Public Health to measure it applies this measure by Madame Dubarry on the confiscated assets. This topic is rather typical, and this justifies a barter. And the third step is selling wine and liquor of the people sentenced. This measure has been confirmed in 1995 when trade starts again. Therefore, the text is sent to all the agents with some form to be filled within 24 hours with the trade, the name of the wine, the amount, to specify quantity, origin, etc. Wine shows the tasting of the existing wine, as well as wine of migrants. For packaging, the precious objects of sentenced people follow the amount of exported goods starting in April. In July, the Commission provides 30 million in precious objects. The Commissioner insists on this useful exchange that is avoiding the exit of liquidity. Payments are mixed. Therefore, we have both liquidity and objects. All this is also mentioned in some brief correspondence. The right of the Commission can only be possible provided the approval of the Tsar approval. The coordination among the commissions is implemented, but it is very difficult. A report by the Commission on the centralization of deposits in Paris acknowledges the tension caused by the activity of the Commission for Trade and the competition among the different administrations. The Commission says that it has been authorized to use diamonds, silverware, jewels, precious furniture of any kind, wine and liquor that can be exported very easily. The Commission says that it doesn't know these measures. Once it has been informed, it has asked for the activity of its agents for an estimate of all movable objects which have been considered, considering that the responsibility for the furniture, for the national movable assets, is up to this Commission. At that time, Terror, there are four competing markets. We have the furniture sold auction in Paris, objects of art and science, then precious furniture for exchanges and trading operations, and then four, we have the furniture for public services like courts. Okay, considering this behavior, what was needed was to exactly set some division between the two commissions vis-à-vis their respective responsibilities asking for preeminence. The connection between Commission for Arts and Subsistence are very nervous, and this is clearly to be seen. During the session of the 4th May in Versailles district, one of the agents has asked for the packaging of a table that would be exchanged with a foreign country. And during the session, the decision is taken to have this selling stopped and to inform about abuse of power, without asking the Commission of Arts. The Commission for Subsistence wants to exchange with the foreign country some precious objects which can get lost. The inspector is charged with exporting very precious objects. In December, and therefore it is asking for the intervention of a Commission of Arts. Okay, I'm finishing. The action of Commission of Arts has given its result, and the system of barter implemented will last several years. In 86-87, some Greek, in 1906-7, some Greek captains were paid with paintings, precious furniture, cloth, coming from aristocratic palaces. Therefore, they have to give them back. Thank you very much.
We will take a half-hour coffee break and come back and hear the last paper and have questions. Thank you. There's a book I'm going to recommend. It's called Legal Plunder. Okay, I think that's on. Thank you. Welcome. Our fourth speaker today is Francie Michaud from the University of Calgary in Canada.
Thank you. I will start right away. Make sure that I'm within the 20 minutes allotted. Workers in late medieval Marseille, a society hardwired by a monetized culture, proved keenly attentive to forms of cashless payments and labor contracts. Governed by the spirit of contractual law binding two free individuals, work conventions rested on a transfer of specie for the vast majority of adult laborers, yet rarely without due consideration to other forms of exchange currencies. Weighed against their market value, goods and services loomed pretty large, of course, in agreements involving young and vulnerable dependents who represented a significant large segment of the workforce. All the while, material goods and services were carefully assessed, especially in periods of economic downturn marked by inflation trends and sharp demographic fluctuations, which characterized Marseille from the late 13th century throughout the 14th century. Now, for this paper, I've re-examined the oldest work agreements from Marseille's notarial series between 1248 to 1400, with other pertinent archival narrative materials, with a focus on the goods that mattered most to the contractants across all trades, that is, victuals, clothing, education, and healthcare. First, I'll discuss the contemporary understandings and the nature of compensation in labor agreements before turning to the parties' expectations and obligations with respect to payments in kind and service for rendered labor. Then, and last, I question whether the 14th century crisis altered significantly expectations relative to goods as currencies in labor negotiations. My first point. In Marseille's statutory law, labor obligations were expressed in monetary terms, whether applying to income or penalty in case of contractual violations. However, the term locarium, when used to signify labor payment, encompassed both specie and kind, a mixture of which applied to the majority of laborers, old and young, men and women alike. But the concept also applied to the compensation masters received for the training of new apprentices. The more lucrative the trade, the higher the teaching fees, yet these often assume the form of commodities in lieu or in addition to pecuniary fees. Even when the locarium was handed out as a salary to adult workers, it sometimes excluded hard cash altogether, while the far more substantial number of laborers settled for their keep with only a few coins in complementary earnings. Wageless income, though, was far more often bestowed on apprentices and young servants. For example, goldsmiths never handed out anything else but food, clothing, and shelter to their pupils, no matter how old or productive they were. So when Bermond-Pellissier, a 16-year-old self-described goldsmith, placed himself as a senior trainee with Raymond de Fabregas, his salary consisted of food, clothes, shelter, no cash at all, but, and not least, the secrets, quote-unquote, of the master's art. Robert de Rochat, another goldsmith who had his own son as a trainee for 8 years with a fellow artisan, did not expect him either to earn any wages during his apprenticeship, even though he had likely exposed his boy to the mysteries of the art. More to the point, Robert underscored the importance, and I quote, of good education to secure a God-pleasing and honest living in this world, unquote. Education was a priceless immaterial good held dear by many a parent, an ethical duty beholding masters to instruct dutifully their discipuli out of fairness, quote-unquote, equitas, as a fisherman and his wife reminded their child's master, another fisherman. And just like the young goldsmith I mentioned before, Bermond-Pellissier, many senior apprentices exchanged their labor in return for advanced training, no cash involved, including intellectual knowledge. Jean Breton wanted to have the schoolmaster who hired him as a teaching assistant to instruct him, I quote, in the science of the liberal arts, with no wage at all involved. Likewise, a mother asked a friar to take her 8-year-old son as a servant in exchange for his formal education as well, during 6 years, and I quote, as if he were your son or your brother, unquote. until the time apprentices could master skillfully an art that enabled them to make an honest living, parents' main concern was their children's fair treatment at the hands of the master. Children's limited ability to earn a few coins for their output while in artisanal training was hardly an issue for parents. After all, many were themselves artisans, relying on apprentices' cheap labor in their own business operations. Parents supported the trade-off implied in competent professional education as long as the masters kept their children safe and sound and under decent material conditions, which were themselves weighed against their market value in accordance with the dependent's the child's social status. The notion now of decency, commonly stipulated in labor contracts, was evidently adapted to individual social and domestic status within masters' households. Thus, co-workers recruited as a team may well receive differential earnings both in cash and in kind. For instance, in 1382, 3 sailors sold their services together. In yearly income, the first was offered 16 florins, plus 2 pairs of stockings, 2 robes, one in color worth 1 florin de cane, the other made of white coarse wool cloth, and 2 hoods. Now, his colleagues, though, received half his earnings in cash, that is 8 florins each. While one of them was offered 2 marine dresses, the other one was given only a simple tunic. The robe of color requested by the team leader was surely meant as a status-granting good. Blood family, governed by birthright hierarchies, did not escape either a graduated quality scale for payments due in kind. When Jean Rimbaud found work with his son Antoine as swine herders for the Holy Spirit Hospital, he was content to share a sum of 20 florins in wages with Antoine, as long as the white, heavy woolen dress given to him in extra income was worth a whopping 14 florins, his son's only 6 florins. The brothers Pierre and Antoine Olivier, hired as custodians to tend a nobleman's stable, faced a similar treatment. Pierre was promised 6 florins in cash, 12 eminas of wheat, 9 eminas of barley, 8 milirolas of pure wine, and 1 can of fabric. Antoine, his younger brother, assumed, however, got only 5 florins, 10 eminas of wheat, and 6 milirolas of wine, but no barley and no fabric. That leads me to my second point, goods and services between expectation and obligation. Now, when masters offered additional income in kind, it was often the result of a customized agreement, pactum in singular, which was struck beyond conventional trade practices. These personalized deals emerged mostly in the post-plague years, a time when the job market had tightened up. In the pre-plague era, these provisions were no less subject to bargaining forces, but then they favored mostly masters. After all, Marseille's late 13th, early 14th century was a period marked by inflation, economic decline, and reduced monetary velocity. When a pastry maker from Flanders transited through the city in August 1320, waiting for safe passage to the Holy Land in the following spring, he offered his skills to a fellow artisan at no wages at all. All he wanted for his sweat was shelter and, quote-unquote, decent food, so to avoid digging into my savings for the pilgrimage, unquote. Victuals were a dear currency. In 1338, a teacher sued a woman for 1 florin of gold because she had failed to provide his meals when he tutored her child, as they had agreed. Evidently, food security was a dire issue in times of scarcity, which was a recurring threat in the community throughout the entire period. That a master on his deathbed in 1320 left money to procure his handmade lifetime provisions in the form of bread and wine rather than money speaks volume to this endemic problem. At the time of the bread famine, only 2 years later, in 1322-23, that was ravaging the city, a coral fisherman obtained from his employer the monthly provision of wheat for himself, but also for his wife before sailing off. Food provisioning did not come cheap, certainly not to the minds of those who had to defray its cost. From beginning to end of apprenticeship periods, youth's productivity input was expected to grow exponentially, and conversely, maintenance expenditures to decline. This consideration determined whose responsibility it was to supply not only food, but also clothing and medical care. In the pre-plague period, it was normally a parent's duty to provide for their children, either through the disbursement of yearly fees or outright commodities yielded to masters. Even wealthy masters, with easier access to cash, sought cereals by way of payments for the instructional services. For instance, the money changer Jean Cordier demanded from his pupil's father large quantities of wheat in addition to hefty fees, and that the child be properly clothed. Never in abundant supply, grains remained throughout the entire period understood, as I said, as sought-after currency, even in the post-plague years. True, contracts initiated by seafarers stipulated that meals would be provided as part of their recruit's salary. And when, in 1387, a mariner affirmed that, and I quote, "It is customary in seafaring that youngsters be provided with clothes, in health as in sickness," unquote, it was also, by all accounts, fairly accurate. But meals, along with clothing adapted to the environmental conditions of the trade, represented the bulk of their junior staff's income. After all, masters who procure these essential goods did so for optimal output, since their young help, mostly aged between 15 and 17, represented an already profitable source of labor at low salary costs, that is, on average 2 florins in wages a year, for up to 10 to 12 years of service. When clothing provisions were carefully detailed in notarized agreements, they reflected the sartorial outfitting of seafarers. In 1376, a young migrant secured a 4-year placement with a fisherman at the rate of 2.5 florins a year, payable at contract ends only, but with the assurance of receiving every year 2 white woolen tunics, 2 shirts, and 2 pairs of trousers, in addition to shoes, generally a lesser expense. Although the quality of vestments may vary, they generally point to modest, work-related apparel. Yet, even tunics and simple dresses were not cheap, since they could easily fetch up to 32 to 40 solidi apiece, while the contemporary court makers' wages were below 2 solidi a day without meals. Either for personal or professional use, clothing was a much valued currency in labor contracts. When the mariner Laurent Vincent was waiting to sail off on the galley, he received an advance salary only pieces of garments and was specifically forbidden to alienate or sell them until after his return to port. As mentioned before, these expenses in the urban crafts, notably before the Black Death, were often paid by parents until the time their children proved sufficiently productive to offset their maintenance costs, even when masters had access to the commodities, raw materials. In 1332, the tailor Guillaume d'Albi expected that his trainee's father provide his child with a doublet, a jipa sort of a skirt, every year, and 1 cotton shirt the first year of his 4-year apprenticeship. For their part, apothecaries not only impose hefty educational fees on their pupils' parents, but also the added obligation to cover all sartorial necessities and medical care. In truth, medicinal costs and doctors' fees proved a matter of tight negotiations with masters, even health practitioners. When the apothecary Jacques d'Orange entered an apprenticeship agreement with Gantel Bermond, he promised to train the latter's son in his art for the lads for 2 years, and I quote, "as long as he remained healthy," however, unquote. Some other apothecaries were willing to cover the lad's expense when traveling outside the city, or if they got sick under their roof and nowhere else. Otherwise, they would be promptly returned to their parents until recovery. A truly exceptional case is that of the carpenter Antoine Lucie, who dispensed his new apprentice, and I quote, it's a long quote, "from refunding his day of work and his meals if he cut himself or fell while on the job," which he admits often occurs in the trade, but with the caveat that if he got ill due to fever or other ailments, he would have to pay back his food and all the additional expenses in medicines and physician's care made on his behalf, unquote. Concerned by such liabilities, goldsmiths interrupted their teaching in case of illness and sent their pupils back to their parents to be cared for and convalesce at their expense. Other employers treaded carefully, though, especially if they were in want of fresh, talented hands. This is why a leading merchant, Pierre Austria, is fairly well known in the city, attracted to his business a junior partner by offering not only hefty wages, meals, and shoewear, but also healthcare coverage. In sum, when there was a reasonable balance of power between the contractual parties, this particular good was carefully considered. That leads me to my last point, negotiations in the post-plague years. With the advent of the Black Death and the massive labor shortages that ensued, new habits started to emerge in the way commodities were used as currencies and salary payments. Traction and retention factors led to the procurement of food to contractual workers, the generic cibo et potu, which was then included in most agreements. Likely to encourage new vocations, training fees also declined. Still, those among the craftsmasters who charged their parents for the teaching labor of the kids requested payments in the most basic form of goods, wheat. In 1363, a cooper opened his workshop to a 20-year-old youth in exchange for quantities of wheat for 2 years of training, while a tailor a few years later, in 1371, only agreed to impart his knowledge to a 10-year-old boy if his father paid in copious quantities of both wheat and wine. The father in question was a peasant, though, probably supplies so. But a new trend across many occupational sectors, already manifest in the early 1350s, was taking hold, whereby additional provisions besides food, such as clothes and shoewear, were granted to young workers at the employer's expense, despite masters' resistance in more conservative, lucrative trades, such as among the merchants and the drapers, for instance. However, employers like seafarers on the whole seem now better inclined to offer meals to adult workers performing under their roofs. The allocation of clothes, shoes, and medicine varied sensibly between and within trades. Salaried butchers often obtained shoes but no clothing. In the leather industry, only 1 in 3 workers were offered shoes despite employers' access to cheaper raw material. Even then, this particular benefit disappeared altogether from the extant contracts beyond the mid-1360s. Meanwhile, wages had remained stubbornly stable. In fact, evidence shows that salaried artisans such as shoemakers and bakers did not see their wages change over several decades, a reality that is also matched by landless agricultural laborers, low-ranked seafarers, and a host of unqualified workers, including women. Hence, salaries remitted in goods mattered more than ever. With the stabilization of both wages and the local currency in the last third of the 14th century, extras in kind sometimes followed tense negotiations regardless of the craft's wage or wage distribution practices, one assumes. Even when the balance of power tipped in favor of an employee, a master may raise careful limitations when conceding goods. For instance, the plowman Jacques Augier offered Douce Jolie to work on her estate at wages under market value because she had committed to provide for his pregnant wife Catherine until after her postpartum recovery, upon which, though, Catherine herself would perform ancillary work in back payment for the midwife's anticipated services. Even so, plowmen enjoyed clout amongst landowners. Beside decent salaries, they gained additional perks in the form of commodities, mostly wheat, wine, meat, and bolts of fabric. All the while, these compliments dispensed to workers specializing in wine and wheat production coincide with heightened activities in the maritime sector in the late 1370s and early 80s, when coral extraction and trade was booming. The local fishermen and mariners were also offered solid, best wages by far, plus meals, some even requesting quality food and adequate clothing, quote unquote. Such was the demand of Etienne Abeille, who, with an annual salary of 100 florins, additionally bargained for a simple can of universal cloth. The enhanced bargaining position of sailors and fishermen explains, in fact, the greater number of contemporary contracts with detailed sartorial descriptions, a clear indication that these provisions were valued beyond customary expectations. Although documentary evidence speaks in the 2 noted periods of increased labor demand, that is, in the early 1350s and especially in this sector, maritime sector, around mid-1370s and early 80s. These provisions are mostly detailed in hiring contracts of lower middle rank staffers within the maritime trades hierarchy in compensation for their modest wages. This is well illustrated by the sailor Bernard de Saint-Florentin, who in 1382 found work with a mariner at the rate of 10 florins, but with the understanding that he would also be handed 2 tunics of lamb wool, 2 pairs of trousers, 2 shirts, one of which he would get whenever he wanted, unquote. However, after 1385, the balance of power tipped the other way. Then, perks dwindled conspicuously and garments expected in pairs all but disappeared. As in other trades, masters were now keen to formally limit their commitments. In a special agreement with the mother of his famulus, a fisherman promised only maritime shoes and 1 tunic for the boy during the entire 3 years of service, and he added nothing more, unquote. This echoes the more general trend, which, a last case, I hope will illustrate, that of plowman Antoine Prime, who in 1400 found work for a year with Geoffroy Ecart, a local artisan and entrepreneur. Geoffroy, aware of his new employee's dire need for credit, agreed to advance him 45% of his wages, the remainder payable at year's end, with the warning that, and I quote, should Antoine's household fall into indigence in the interim, the master alone would decide, according to his goodwill and discretion and not otherwise, whether to remit his earnings in wheat or in coins. Now, given the renewed volatility of the local money that very year, one may surmise that wheat, by far, would be what Antoine would have hoped as the preferred currency. And that leads me to the conclusion. In light of the collected data, I'm tempted to conclude that goods and services serve to gauge the nature of social relations in labor agreements. Between the end of the 13th century and the turn of the 15th century in Marseille, market forces, themselves impacted by exogenous factors, affected these dynamics. Younger laborers, given the limited ability to earn cash for a living, had to rely more heavily on commodity goods dispensed by their masters. Masters, though, followed 2 distinct approaches in the procurement of goods and services, as a compensation for lack of a limited amount of cash, but also as salary bonuses. The former typically applied to young or unskilled workers, the latter to sought-after artisans. The frequency, quantity, and quality of the goods and services offered in exchange for work responded to the laws of supply and demand according to economic trends, notwithstanding personal status and circumstances in a century of unrelenting upheavals. The labor shortages following the Black Death stimulated across many trades the supply of additional earnings, but essentially in the guise of food to workers of all stripes, young and old, with extra-sectorial benefits offered to the young rather than in hard cash. Yet, in-demand laborers, notably those specializing in the land and sea extractive industries, which underwent a brief but thriving expansion around the late 1370s and early 1380s, enjoyed special extras granted by masters. They did so, however, with a clear focus on goods that mattered dearly: basic victuals, regular clothing, healthcare. In addition to training skills, those goods, which ensured a rudimentary quality of life, had been all along the most valued currencies at the heart of labor negotiations, whether led by employers or employees, parents or masters, and were well worth fighting for. So thank you. Grazie.
If the rest of the panelists will come up, I invite the audience to come up and please select one of the or more. Please. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you.
I have to make my name?
Yes. Do you want to ask any questions? We'll start with Aidan Collins, Kache Antunes.
Thanks everyone for your papers. I guess I have a question for Aidan to start. I would like to, I'm not sure whether I understood what you're saying, so I would like to go back to your point about liabilities and how you see in some of the examples you've mentioned, particularly when you showed the sources, that business, so personal liability infers into personal bankruptcy. So there's, transference of personal liabilities and assets into covering for business failure. I wonder whether, once looking at your sources, whether you see a trend that differentiates into typologies of business. Because once you read Hoppet and the last book on merchants by Edmund Smith, clearly in common law, but also in English world, including the Atlantic, it seems that there is a very clear notion of what liability is for merchants. So I was wondering what kind of business were you referring to when you spoke about this transferability of personal assets into business bankruptcy? Thank you.
The next question is by Natacha. You can speak into the microphone.
C'est trois petites questions. Simplement parce que je n'ai pas...
Have three questions. You said it was impossible to separate labor, liability. I did not understand what you said. You mean there was a slide in another moment indicating wage. The word wage.
Du travailleur.
The difference between a wage and salary. I did not understand how was the payment made, and then for plaintiffs and defendants, did you have lawyers as well besides the plaintiffs and defendants? I hope the question is clear. But in the case of Elizabeth, the case that you described, was there any role played by the court in this trial, or in this appeal?
Was it completely open? Sorry, I'll ask it again. Were any goods off limits in debt recovery? There are certain times tools of the trade, for example, would be exempt from confiscation. Do you find any discussion of that? Obviously, you're mainly looking at the documents of practice, but I'd be curious in in legal treatises whether this type of issue is ever discussed, and then how it plays out in the actual court. All right, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. I think these are all fairly similar questions in many ways. So the point I was trying to make about personal liability and business liability is really sort of coming from Margaret Hunt's argument that bankruptcy is a personal failure so it is an individual that goes bankrupt. But a lot of the times these individuals, as we know now, are part of a household economy, part of a, yeah, I would say a household economy. They're part of working within a household. So what you see in the examples I gave on the slide is how they take an inventory of everything that's in the household. And everything that's in the household or the workshop or anything that they could get access to is fair game, pretty much. So they can use anything they get access to. They can break into people's houses, which under common law you couldn't do previously. They can seize anything and they can sell them, and you can see they're actually advertising for these goods and the land and etc. to be sold. So my point is that in response to the first question, it's very difficult to try and work out who is, that was from a bankrupt called Edward Halliday, whose is Edward Halliday's goods and whose is his mother's goods and whose is his sister's goods, because the house is a place of business. So you can't really separate what's going on in terms of business and what's going on in terms of running the household. So that's really difficult. In response to the sort of difference between wage and salary, what you see about the payments being made is that they weren't paid. So he's agreed, what was it, X amount per year, £8 I think it was, per year to look after the child. And that's just accumulated. He's never got paid that. When he ends up being indebted himself £100, but he's owed £150, which is not uncommon. So he's trying to say, right, I need to pay off this £100 to his sister, and his sister agrees to give him the stagecoach and some horses and some other goods to pay off his debt. He doesn't manage to pay off his debt, so then the bankruptcy process happens. So you have this sort of agreement that they're going to be paid £8 a year, but it's never actually happened. Do you know what I mean? So, yeah, the lawyer, and then coming on to the, I don't really know the difference between wage and salary. I'm not sure that matters too much because, like I say, they're not actually getting paid. They're just getting it put off and put off and put off. In terms of the lawyers, I think that's interesting, and there's been a lot of work done on lawyers. It's not something, I don't think it's something you can, when you're looking at the sources of these court documents, what survives is these big documents, and that's what we're using as the sources, so you try and run through them. And they're obviously created plaintiffs in collaboration with lawyers, in collaboration with people who work for the court, in collaboration with people who work in the bankruptcy process outside. So it's very difficult, to, in my opinion, to sort of separate out what the lawyer's doing, what the individual's doing. You can just look at it as a source base. But there are people doing work on that. It's not something I'm particularly, I don't find it particularly useful to try and work out the lawyers, but there are a growing number of lawyers and a growing number of court advocates that work during this period. And yeah, in this example I gave about Elizabeth, and there's many other examples, what is the court doing? Yeah, the role played by the court is not to, like we would imagine it today, come to a definitive answer. So they don't really, in some cases the plaintiffs win outright, and in that case the defendants won outright. So the plaintiff's case was dismissed. What actually happens in most cases is they say, right, you're bankrupt, you might be a defendant or you might not, or you might be a plaintiff or you might not, you might be periphery to the thing, to the actual case. The court tries to run through these debts and say, okay, right, creditor A, fair enough, you can get 100% of your debt. Creditor B, less so, 50%. You see what I mean? So they run through this arbitration process. And so the court is really an arbitrator, is trying to mediate in social and financial affairs. It's not really trying to decide cases yes or no, winner or loser, outright decision or not. Yeah, the legal treaties are quite interesting at the time. They're quite clear on the theory of how bankruptcy is supposed to work. And I think the good thing about the court cases I've got is where they've all broken down, so they've gone wrong. So often I find that when a system breaks down, it reveals the most interesting aspects of that system. And you can sort of try and put it back together, see how the correct, linear, ideal path that it should have gone and how it hasn't. I think there's so many examples of how the legal treaties and the statutes say that it should work compared to how it does in reality. So I think that there's real disparities between how the law is supposed to work and how it does. And that's one thing I'm really interested in, especially when it comes to, you know, this is a paper on alternative currencies, so the way that they try and get an external value on these goods and services is just somewhat chaotic compared to how it should go. I think that answers all the questions. Is that okay?
Thank you. Now we'll have questions for Lambrecht and Waele. This will be Philip Schofield.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much indeed, Thijs and Tom, for a very interesting paper. I was thinking, as I was listening to it, about the kind of equivalence that we might see in an English context. And I can certainly think of examples where tenants have been able to negotiate really quite good food returns when it comes to, for example, harvest, but not the sort of generality of what you were describing. And I was really intrigued and impressed by this idea of a longer-term negotiation between tenants and their lords leading out of the later Middle Ages and the early modern period, and the ways in which that might suggest a dialogue rather than an imposition in the way that you set out. And I wondered, in a sense, why it is that, or rather, to put it another way, are there negatives in that relationship? Is what you're describing so overwhelming that tenants are prepared to put aside what we might identify in other contexts as the negatives? Again, in an English context, and sorry for the comparison, we would think perhaps of the ways in which tenants feel that they want to escape the label of unfreedom, or they want to have different tenurial rights over their land, so property rights might change. Do these just not really exist in the dialogue? Are they less significant? And is what you're describing effectively overwhelming that's putting those things to one side, or am I just misconceiving it from an English perspective?
Katja.
So the question for Thijs and for Tom. So when you presented on the commutation, so if I understood what your explanation, peasants can buy themselves out of corvée. That would mean that lords need to have a flex labor force every year to be able to fill in the gaps, right? So how does that, in that case, how would this create a kind of almost proletariat or volatile workforce permanently on the countryside? At the same time, you explained actually there's no incentives for peasants to buy themselves out of labor because they're being so well treated, basically. So do you see changes over time? I mean, when are the negative incentives for peasants to buy themselves out of this regime? And does that have implications for this flexibility in the labor force in the Flemish, Low Countries labor market in the countryside? And I guess that what's on the other end of this question is also if you can buy yourself out of the corvée work or any other services, where do you get your income to do this? Right? So where are the positive and the negative incentives of these, and when across time, so if you stretch it, because your argument goes up to, I think, the transition from the medieval to the early modern period. So when does this, I mean, how does the system react to economic crisis or economic growth? Thank you.
Elena.
Thank you so much for the paper. I think my question is somewhat related to the previous two. I was very intrigued when, at the beginning of your paper, you mentioned that one of the reasons you may want to buy yourself out of corvée labor was that you found it humiliating. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the social connotations and the symbolic value of persistent corvée labor in the cases you described. Does the social meaning change because it's being remunerated by the lords now? Is the power dynamic different there and recognized by the community? Or do the material conditions change but the symbolic value stays the same?
And actually, I had a question that was somewhat similar to Elena's, and this is at the end of your paper, you speculate that the food rations not only had a value in terms of their calories, but probably also had a symbolic meaning. And actually, this is going to be a question for Francine as well. You're speculating about that. Is there any, and I mean, you're probably right, but is there any contemporary evidence of the symbolic value? And if there is, what do you think? I mean, it seems to me that maybe clothing or definers of the quality of clothing or the types of shoes, you could perhaps read more into the value and therefore the symbolic meaning, or in fact, maybe what you mean is symbolic meaning has not that much to do with value. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Could you talk about that? And it's an issue that a lot of people have touched upon in terms of alternative currencies, and I think I'd like to get it out in the open because your two papers are really talking about that to some extent. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you for your questions. Concerning the first, and I think what Philip asked and what Katja asked is somewhat similar, in the sense that these labor services continue to exist, especially during the late medieval periods, because there is structural underemployment. So what changes during the early modern period, especially as proto-industrialization, rural industries emerge, is that time becomes more valuable for those households. And rather than working for the lord in exchange for a food ration, they just use the income generated by proto-industry to buy themselves free from these labor services. So I think timing matters. What we see is that this system thrives during the 13th, 14th and 15th centuries, but thereafter, in many cases, they disappear. I think as a result of, because the peasantries do not longer want to work for the lord, but also because many lords abandon direct exploitation, will lease their domains and have no demand for these servile works. In terms of the other question Philip asked, indeed, I know the work of Burrell, who has described similar exchanges of food between lords and their tenants. One of the major differences between, I think, England and the Low Countries is that these food rations relate to all inhabitants of the seigneury, regardless of their legal status, because at this stage, only a very, very, very small minority of the peasantries can be labeled as unfree, but all the inhabitants of the lordship had to perform these duties. And of course, there is no shortage of conflicts between peasantries and their lords, and we have some example of really recalcitrant peasants who, despite the food they were offered, despite the services that they were offered, still did not want to go to work for the lord. And this is because part of these remuneration schemes are not equal, or have different meaning to different social groups. Pasture rights are only relevant if you have a cow or if you have cattle to pasture. In equal way, for example, if you look at the transport monopolies in Bergen op Zoom, a peasant without horses does not profit from this. Also, what I wanted to stress is that in these customers, of course, it's not only about labor services. We see other kinds of exchanges related to tenancy, related to other seigneurial rights. But I think what we see is that a gradual weakening of lordly power during the late Middle Ages. And Tom has described this in a recent paper, how during the second half of the 14th century, lords tried to impose new forms of surplus extractions, but were successfully halted in this respect by the Count of Flanders. And also what we found is that the decision to either execute the work or to pay the commutation fee was highly individual and could change from one year to another, and was also very different between households. And this is what struck me in this material. Of course, and this is what the impression I got was that organizing labor services, servile works, requires a lot of organization, overseeing, checking who is available, who is coming, who is paying, and who is executing the works. So what we see is that they combined traditional wage labor with the servile works in many cases when the lords had to mow their meadows or transport stones from quarries and so on. So what we actually see is a mixed composition of laborers, consisting, I think, varying from one year to another of a majority of peasants executing servile works, and in other years a majority of wage laborers. Was it humiliating? In a way, I found many of the clauses humiliating for the lords, and not so much for the peasantries, because what you clearly see is that, especially in the second half of the 14th century, that the power resides with the peasantries and no longer with the lord. I'm hesitant to use the term humiliating to characterize these labor services, especially during the late medieval period. I think in earlier periods the tables were the lord had the strongest role in negotiating with the peasants. So I think indeed that they were humiliating, but not particularly during the late medieval period. And as regards the symbolic meaning, what you can see in the sources that some sources specifically refer to this as a feast. After the servile works have been executed, there is the word in the source is kermes, which is a kind of annual feast that is being organized. Also, for example, in the description of labor services by the Lord of Dadizele, it's clearly noted that all the children of the workers are also invited to come and eat. But I acknowledge your critique in the sense that I wrote that it also had a symbolic meaning, but I have to substantiate that claim with more details and more examples. So, okay.
For Natacha, Michaela Barbeau.
Merci beaucoup pour votre intervention.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I've got 3 questions. The first question is about the quantity. Do you have some sources to better understand the quantities? To compare quantities between luxury goods given and the quantity of goods. So, commodities. Do you have some comparative data available? The second question is about the estimates. And do you have some estimates for these quantities? Third point, maybe you don't have, you didn't keep track of, is the difference between, real and tangible and intangible assets. things that were just considered as tangible, and they were not tangible assets. So a sort of split between tangible and not tangible assets also in the inheritance lines. And also the comparison between luxury goods and commodities.
Natacha, my question is on the diamond. It's a rather strange stone, totally useless. I come from trade, right? And one of the first things that we learn or teach students is that you can talk about trade in the early modern period, except diamonds. We never talk about diamonds. Because diamonds work counterintuitively in the market against any other commodity that you can think of in the pre-modern world. So my question is, how is value established? And Michaela just touched slightly on that, but I would like to know specifically on the diamonds. How do you dump a huge amount of diamonds in the market and you get value for it? Everything we know about diamonds would say you cannot buy anything with this. You can buy a lot with 1 diamond. You can buy absolutely nothing with 100 diamonds. So this is how trade works. But your context is different. So I wonder, how is value attached to all of these diamonds that are put in the market? For someone coming from trade, 0. You put 1 diamond, you buy the whole city of Paris in foodstuffs. No problem. You put 100 diamonds in the market, you can't buy anything. Just out there. Thank you.
And I have a third question, and that is, I'm very curious about the enforcement mechanism for alternative currencies, the luxury products. Diamonds are easily hidden. It strikes me that the administrators could easily steal some. Was that recognized in the system? But I'm also curious about smuggling. I mean, this is an era of great smuggling, especially of fine wines and liquor. How do the authorities deal with that problem?
I want to respond. So the quantities of goods is very well documented. So we have some permits to export. That's a sort of administrative process through the procurement commission and also approved by the committee. A full set of authorization to export. Everything is very well detailed. So we got merchants who already detailed this process. The French merchants, delivering or exporting some commodities. Absolutely everything is fully detailed. Not the total value, which is not given, but everything is detailed. We have a full inventory provided. And also the imports of commodities and the imports of raw materials. Everything is described in this document. At the same time, how could I say, that's a very detailed report. Each object is not priced, but each group of objects is showing some value, having a price, and quantities are very well defined, determined. It's not the full inventory, but it's almost done, is almost fully documented. I've been very much struck by the details shown in this document. I was thinking of you, of course, just a while before. So we have something common to share, and so I'm sharing you one case, many cases to share. That's incredible with this period of time. So all documents, we got some deeds of the Public Health Committee, and also other deeds in the files, in the archives. And everything is very well documented. We have a deed for everything, with some experts being appointed to this extent. And very often I met them, because I met them when I was studying the 18th century before the revolution, being the goldsmiths known in Paris, dealing and also selling diamonds. And for wines, I don't know the wines so well, but I thought I could taste wines. Because we have to taste wines. Tasting wine is good to better understand the quality of wines to be drunk. So this is very useful for wine merchants, traders, to sell the wines in Paris on the Paris market. Like when we uncork a bottle of wine, usually, you know what I mean, don't you? So we have some names are being noted, so I can just make a research on the name of these experts, of these specialists. For diamonds, it's really incredible. So that's really, a sort of currency. So, but I can give you everything. And for the cleavage, so once again, it depends very much. This study depends on the legal test. We have a lot of legal tests for this separation, this separation. So also we have the separation between real estate and non-real estate assets. We have all these distinctions, buildings and whatever, so luxury stuff. Everything is very well shown, very well detailed. Above all, what matters is land property first and foremost. I thought I answered for diamonds and the value, so the market value of diamonds, and now we can make these assessment. We have carats. Diamonds are stones. We have to consider carats of diamonds. I don't know all details. Also, we have the Antwerp market, which is very important, also Rotterdam market, Antwerp market, and so the Paris market is connected with these other markets. And when I read the sources you can't read now, so the diamonds have been evaluated, assessed. Depends on the quality of the stone. And we go back to the expertise. Our special experts who can value diamonds. I can't add on anything more, and so we couldn't buy the entire foodstuff for the entire city of Paris. The diamond, I've seen diamond also elsewhere. I studied also last wheels in the revolutionary period. So I was reading last wheels during the Terror period, during the revolution, and we have a lot of mentions of diamonds, and we pay. I mean, the ones who wrote the last wheel with diamonds, and the value of diamonds is always reported for contemporary scholars, not raising problems. Valuing diamonds, valuing one stone. I don't know if I really answer you because. I want to be very practical, just having my feet on ground. And hidden diamonds, once again, you know what I mean, don't you? How could I tell you? Immigrants, they leave, migrants leave, and the men of the Republic. Okay, but you can't imagine the incredible amount of object lists I found. Very detailed object list, incredible. Thousands of lists of objects belonging to such and such aristocrat with a precise name and surname, and for precious stones or gems and diamonds. We have the entire list. Full traceability of precious stones and diamonds is provided. We know the owners of these diamonds. We know we also have hidden diamonds being hidden into walls of some buildings. But we know the owners of these buildings. And also we know there have been a huge deal of thefts of diamonds. And I wrote something on Madame de Berry. Le Château de Lucie had this perfect case, and we found a huge quantity of diamonds hidden in the walls. And there was just a long story. All jewels have been stolen during the revolution, which is not true, because all jewels were just hidden in the closet, in the wall of the castle. And also she just published a note to have a good reward in order to find the jewels stolen. So this has been a quite complicated story. So she didn't realize what she was doing, and she was arrested. She was arrested because she was telling a lie, a huge lie, jewels not stolen, but hidden in the walls of the castle, So we have some reports also of hidden diamonds, and what was stolen in the households, and also, hidden in very, very close shrines, everything very well detailed. I don't know if I answer all questions so far.
Est-ce que la présence des esclaves domestiques à Marseille, comme dans
the presence of slaves in the Mediterranean area, so the possibility of exploiting servile labor, if this would affect or reduce the volume of goods and the nature of compensation in kind you mentioned, if these would have a negative impact, considering that there was some competition between servile labor and the lords, therefore taking advantage of this benefit in order not to be exposed to the obligation of paying the services.
J'avais juste une remarque d'abord qui est
I have a remark.
Par la variété des
I was very much surprised by the variety of payments. So health training.
cette variété-là. Et ma question,
I was very much surprised by this huge variety. So my first question was about negotiation. We started speaking of notarial deeds. Is there any difference? And then another question. The third question, the request for education. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Sources provide any evidence that the payments in kind have a symbolic function beyond the monetary or value?
Thank you. Thank you for your, I don't know if I should thank you for your challenging questions, but thank you for them. They're very good, actually. I'll start with the first one. That's an obvious one about, can I see the person who asked? Sorry. Oh, sorry. See, I'm blind. It's a classic question. And for people who are working on Provence for this time period, at least as far as I know, again, I'm looking at notarial records. I looked also at, although I didn't talk about it here, but if you look at the sources, you'll see I mentioned some legal sources as well. I went through the court records, litigations, and so on and so forth. So all I can say is in accordance with the current historiography on slavery in this time period in Provence, Marseille, I haven't found a whole lot of evidence on slavery, on slaves, personal slaves. They exist, they're domestic slaves, but only a handful, certainly not in a work contract. When I find them, it's in the wills that I've looked at, personal documents. I'm sorry to answer you in English, I should in French probably. Okay, thank you for, I'm a bit mixed up here. And so, yeah, so the evidence that I collected over the years by looking at different documents, notarial documents, including, but not exclude, wills and work contracts, plus the legal documents, I haven't found enough document to support that theory, which is sound, what you're proposing, but it wouldn't substantiate what I see from the documents, actually. So no, I think it's a matter of negotiation between masters and their free hired contractual workers. It's based on, I think, on the laws of supply and demand, but a host of other factors that we have to look at in the contextual frame over time, over this 150-year period. So that's why I'm very hesitant to pinpoint, there's not one model, that's what I'm trying to say. However, slavery is not something that I would use as a factor that may influence the negotiation process.
For example, in Barcelona,
yeah.
Slaves were forbidden to work in certain activities.
Right.
Just not to make
disloyal. Yes, exactly, competition, yeah. I'm aware that they are used elsewhere, but again, I've looked into that for a very long time, to the records for a very long time, and at first, when I was a student, I was expecting to see a good many references to obviously slaves, not only within, through the wills and testaments, but also obviously when I started to look into work contracts and legal documents. I found some, but they're only a handful of cases, and I cannot really use them certainly not in statistical ways. It's impossible. And it's also all spread throughout the period of 150 years. So I would feel uncomfortable to draw that parallel. Yeah. Question en français. Là. Parce que je me souviens. La variété des. Quelle est la. Vous pouvez la reformuler? C'est une observation
oui,
sur
une observation, c'est ça.
Ah, c'est le caractère de négociation et d'entente tacite. Oui. OK. Alors là, j'essaie de me souvenir dans le texte où j'ai parlé d'accord tacite. J'aimerais le retrouver parce que...
I remember a text mentioning that because actually negotiation.
Il faut que ça soit fondé sur du réel, du concret, donc les documents comme tels.
A tacit agreement. There was a tacit agreement. Documents mentioning exchange agreements and what is being given and what is being received.
On pourrait se parler
agreements signed by the parties. Okay, we can speak about that in private. I have to look at the context. It can be something, a possible reality. Okay, I start with a source. I start from that. When I work, I used all the documents available, notarial deeds, etc. And this allowed me to examine these documents. And it is the reason why I'm in favor not the oscillative approach. I'm very much based on the narrative approach, trying to see the nuance and the principle that was being mentioned. There is always a possible value in a specific context. Education.
Qui nous arrive dans les documents. Il y a quelques-uns.
Training. We have some references, for example, in apprenticeship contracts, education and training. But I have there are enough cases where I can say that this value is being considered as a crucial value by parents and for apprenticeship himself or herself. Therefore, training is important. There is a notarial form, and there are other elements I'm very much interested in vis-à-vis the model, which is constant, and then we have explanations starting from the moment when we have many more cases, which means that there is some expression of value. I'm sure that this value does exist.
Done. If you will, do you want to say more?
You had a question?
Yes, well, I was wondering if you were going to ask it.
I can answer
go ahead.
very briefly
Go
if
ahead.
you want. Yes, the same answer to this. There are a few kernels and few pearls throughout the documents, but as I mentioned in the paper, it is clear to me when you contrast the individuals, especially those who work in team, whether they're father and son or colleagues, it's remarkable to see the difference of treatment, and especially when one insists of having, or when the fishermen or coral mariners would insist to be fed properly or to be fed the same as the master. That doesn't happen very often. But when it happens, again, I pay attention on how many times it happens within the long term, a longue durée. And that's why I'm trying to make sense of that, or to leave it out if it's insignificant. If it happens once in 50 years, I'm not going to pay attention to that. Otherwise, I will. When there are few occurrences, it's enough in a certain, and especially because this particular factor of symbolic value attached to either clothing or food will not be treated in isolation from a methodological perspective. It will be added to other factors, other criteria that I pile up in order to make a case, basically. So, yeah. Thank you for your questions.
Please join me in thanking our panel for a splendid job today. Your work has so much, it's just so interesting that in the data